This description of undiscovered biodiversity is an important component of work aimed at stemming the biodiversity crisis. Tom teaches a course on adaptive radiation, which is this rapid diversification of a single lineage into many species. So our next speaker after Tom is Mary Beth Decker. Mary Beth Decker is a research scientist in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology and a lecturer at the Yale School of the Environment. Her research investigates how oceanographic processes and environmental conditions affect the distribution, abundance, and behavior of marine predators such as jellyfish, fish, and seabirds and their prey. Mary Beth uses a whole range of techniques in her research. She does oceanographic field work to collect data, laboratory experiments, modeling, and analysis also of existing long-term data sets. She teaches courses on the topics of biological oceanography and coastal ecosystems and has just wrapped up a semester teaching 2 classes when she's been particularly busy. And then our last speaker is Eli Fenichel. Eli is the Knobloch Family Professor of Natural Resource Economics in the Yale School of the Environment. His research covers topics ranging from the ocean economy to fisheries to groundwater and human behavior. He was a member of the high-level panel on the sustainable ocean economy and co-led the group's blue paper on measuring the ocean economy. Eli recently returned to Yale after spending over a year and a half in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy as Assistant Director for Natural Resource Economics and Accounting, where he co-led the new National Strategy for Natural Capital Accounting. He teaches courses on merging ecological and economic models and measuring and modeling environmental and socio-environmental systems. So those are our 3 experts on the ocean that we're going to hear from this afternoon. And without further ado, we'll get started with Tom. Thanks, Tom. And I need this.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you to YIBS for inviting me to participate in this lovely symposium today. I'd like to tell a story from the organismal perspective of the Southern Ocean, which in many respects is one of the most unique places on the planet, and I'll be here to convince you that it also has the most unique fish fauna on the planet. Whoa. Okay, so my work focuses at studying the biodiversity of fishes, and I came into this world primarily as a freshwater ichthyologist. Ichthyologist is somebody who studies the biodiversity of fishes. But it'll be 25 years this October that I had the lucky accident of traveling to Antarctica for the first time. I spent a season at McMurdo Sound Research Station, which is the Ross Sea, so the Pacific side, large US research station. And my research also focuses on kind of the big picture relationships among ray fin fishes. Unless if you're a shark nerd, and I ask you to close your eyes and think of a fish, you're thinking of a ray fin fish. So what I'm going to do today is try to tell a story about historic paleoclimate change and how that shaped the biodiversity of this wholly unique fauna of fishes that we have in the Southern Ocean. And what makes this fish fauna really unique is that it's a large oceanic basin that's completely dominated by one group of closely related species. There's nowhere else like this on Earth. Every other set of marine habitats that we would sample, we would get a diverse array of representatives of the major lineages of ray fin fishes. Here we're getting a group of closely related species that share common ancestry and evolutionary time, an age that's younger than the great apes. So sorry, there's no common name, y'all. These are called notothenioids and notothenoidii. If you've ever had Chilean sea bass when that was popular at seafood restaurants, you've eaten a notothenioid, one that is secondarily non-Antarctic. There are about 100 species. They're found in the Southern Ocean, but also in cold temperate areas of the Southern Hemisphere. We'll talk about that in a moment. And if you really are into ray fin fishes and you want to know where in the fish tree of life notothenioids fit in, they're related to this group of species that include perches, sculpins, and sticklebacks. They're a rare example of adaptive radiation in marine fishes. Adaptive radiation doesn't really seem to be a mechanism of lineage diversification in marine fishes. Most groups of marine fishes that are species rich are actually quite old in terms of evolutionary age. And notothenoids attract a lot of attention because they're remarkable adaptations to polar conditions, several of which we'll talk about today. But first, the exploration, and particularly the exploration of biodiversity of Antarctica, is a story of human effort. And what's really cool about this is that the entire history is essentially documented because it's a late coming exploration. We have no written record or no photographs or no films for the first time humans stepped onto New Zealand or the first time humans stepped onto the North American or the South American continent. But we have the documentation of human encounters at the Southern Ocean, Antarctica, quite well. In fact, this ill-fated expedition went out of its way to preserve film that was recorded. So the expedition with Sir Ernest Shackleton, of course, this advertisement would say today, people wanted, and it says for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success. I like to think of this is a true ad for a graduate school at Yale. So Ernest Shackleton, his ship, the Endurance, gets caught in the fast ice of the Weddell Sea, and it's drifting in the ice for several months. It crushes in November of 1915, and his men live on the sea ice, on an ice floe, hoping that it'll take them to Elephant Island. So they use some basically lifeboats, open deck boats, and sail to Elephant Island, a trip that no one had ever taken on an open boat before. And here his men spent on this uninhabited island, the Antarctic Peninsula, the Scotia Arc, for 5 months, living inside of the overturned boats. Ernest Shackleton then went with the skipper of the Endurance, went on an open boat trip that no one had ever taken before to South Georgia in eventual rescue. Nobody died on this expedition. Now, why I think this is really important is that this exploration of Antarctica, you saw those years, this is the start of World War I, was like the last gasp of European and North American exploitation and colonization, that is getting new territory to control. Now, territories flipped between the great powers, the colonial powers after World War I. For example, the Near East went to France and England from the Ottoman Empire. Areas of Southwest and East Germany went to Great Britain after German occupation in World War I. But the exploration of Antarctica was really driven by geopolitics. However, the biologists were like, aha, we're along for the ride. And so this is Louis Dolo, the author of the famous Dolo's Law on irreversible evolution. In 1904, he writes a monograph on these Antarctic fishes. And he has a very sophisticated evolutionary perspective. He's taking his 9-year-old theory out for a test drive using Antarctic fishes. This is a map from that same monograph. Now remember, cartography and occupation of geography is why governments are funding these expeditions. This looks like a map of Antarctica drawn by a grade schooler. So the biology was outpacing the politics and the geopolitics. And it becomes very sophisticated very quickly. If you're really a history nerd, you may know of Lysenko in the Soviet Union and Lysenkoism, which you could tie to the Great Famine of China in the early 1950s. If you look at Antarctic biology, there's this wealth of productivity from Soviet scientists after World War II through the early 1960s. And Antarctic biology was a refuge for biologists escaping Lysenkoism. Just get on a ship, be gone for 8 months, fool the commissar, political officer on the boat, and you could do good science and not worried by be calling a Mendelian capitalist. Now, Antarctica is not only a unique fish fauna, but it has this unique kind of oceanographic perspective. Essentially, it's a large island that's surrounded by an ocean. And it's very different from the Arctic. You think of the Arctic is an inland sea that's surrounded by continental land masses. And Antarctica is also characterized by the west wind drift or the circumantarctic current that leads to a thermal isolation of the Southern Ocean. So this is sea surface temperature. If you're going north from Punta Arenas, Chile, and you're about to cross the Drake Passage, heading south to the Antarctic Peninsula, it's really dramatic when you're on a ship. We have the sea surface temperature logger. There's this precipitous drop in temperature as you cross the polar front. So there's this thermal and likely biogeographic barrier. Now, the story of Antarctica getting cold is one of the geomorphological fragmentation of eastern Gondwana, and there's some debate, but it's centering around 42 million years is where the Drake Passage was open. That is that southern tip of South America in the Antarctic Peninsula, which would allow the formation of the circumantarctic current and the west wind drift. So we think Antarctica was thermally isolated roughly starting about 40 million years ago. And this was really elegantly presented by Celli this morning. But what we can do is reconstructing benthic foraminifera, using benthic foraminifera, sea ocean temperatures, excuse me, not surface temperatures. We could map what's going on through geologic time with regard to the planet getting cooler with aspects that are significant in terms of understanding Antarctic biodiversity. Now, what's really interesting is that Antarctica, as I said, is a place that doesn't have a lot of biodiversity of major lineages of fishes. But if we go back about 50 million years ago, during the Eocene, in the Eocene, at the very tip of very tip of the Antarctic Peninsula, we have this wonderful island, Seymour Island, that has these wonderful fossil formations. And these are representatives of all the fish groups where we find fossils in Antarctica 50 million years ago. This fish fauna looks very similar to what we might find in Long Island Sound. Now, granted, we may not be finding big old billfishes anymore, but I'm sure they were here before humans were overfishing. But we also have representatives of, say, wrasses, laborids, which are kind of your dominant group of fishes on coral reefs. So we have a cosmopolitan temperate freshwater fish fauna 50 million years ago. And basically what we have today is a very depauperate fish fauna that's dominated by one group of closely related species. That is the notothenioids. And granted, we have a few species of skates and rays, but other than that, we have this documented complete faunal turnover when Antarctica was temperate to now when Antarctica is cold, polar. And as I said, to show you this, the fish fauna is completely dominated by this group of closely related species. They comprise about 76.5% of the species diversity. They comprise about 92% of the abundance and about 91% of the biomass. There is nowhere else on the planet where on a continental scale, a group of closely related species dominates the marine vertebrate fauna like we have in the Southern Ocean. Now, this slide is to show two things. One is that we have this happy accident where several non-polar lineages of these notothenioids are around in southern South America and southern New Zealand, southern Australia, that we think were never exposed to polar conditions. And phylogenetically, they're earlier diverging than the lineages we find around Antarctica. Here's a little more detailed phylogeny. A phylogeny is a branching diagram where we're reconstructing the hypothesized relationships among lineages. And the logic of phylogeny is that lineages share common ancestry with a hypothetical common ancestor. And we use homologous traits, traits that we think are present due to shared ancestry, to infer phylogeny. This was one of two of Darwin's theses in his book of 1859, The Origin of Species. He argues all life shares common ancestry. This is how we do that. And the other one that has been refuted to some extent is that natural selection drives all biodiversity. We know that's not the case. Selection is important, but it's not the only mechanism of evolutionary change. What we're looking at this phylogeny is we have the Antarctic species, and the phylogeny is correlated to age estimates. And you may say, oh, you're kind of missing some species here. No, all of these non-Antarctic lineages are really depauperate in their species diversity. You could think of them also, in a sense, as living fossils, in that they're really species poor lineages. So that's real. That's not a result of sampling. And I just want to focus on this one particular species, Elaginops maculavinus, robolo in Spanish is the common name, that is found in southern South America in the Falklands or Islas Malvinas. And in this talk, we'll highlight Elaginops in yellow. It is the living sister species to all of the Antarctic notothenioids that you'll see here called cryonotothenioids. Okay, let's talk a little bit about notothenioids' adaptations of polar conditions. This really cute fish, Trematoma borchgrevink, this is living in the interstices of the sea ice. You can see some amphipods there that it wants to eat. If you were there and you didn't have a dry suit on and you went to touch that fish, the water is negative 1.86 degrees centigrade. So your hand would freeze solid. Now, physiologically, that fish and us are very similar. They have the same osmolarity. We share the same osmolarity. So what's going on? How come they're not freezing solid? Well, this is what that fish should look like. And in fact, if you take a temperate fish and look at freezing point depression from its body fluids, it does not get to where you need to be at negative 1.86 degrees centigrade. However, the Antarctic notothenoids have this lovely protein called antifreeze glycoprotein. It's an alanine threonine repeat with a disaccharide chain that gives you freezing point depression all the way to negative 2.2 degrees centigrade. These are challenges they never face in their natural habitats. Doesn't get that cold. And the AFGP is really cool. Basically, remember, if you say somebody drinks like a fish, you have to characterize if it's a marine or freshwater fish. Freshwater fish don't drink. So if someone never drinks, oh, that person drinks like a freshwater fish. That is because freshwater fishes are losing water to osmolarity. Marine fishes are constantly, they're gaining water due to osmoregulation. Marine fishes are constantly losing water. Got that reversed. So these Antarctic fishes have to be drinking water all the time. And the water is laden with ice crystals. So evolution has provided a protein that originally diverged from a digestive enzyme that basically wraps around ice crystals, and ice crystals are passed out of very dilute urine. Now, I'm not going to talk much about this, but this is such a cool feature, we have to talk about it. So all vertebrates have hemoglobin, right? That is our oxygen transporting molecule. This is a phylogeny of all the Antarctic notothenoids. This derived lineage here, they're called ice fishes. They basically look like juvenile fishes blown up, or embryonic fishes actually. So it's a process in evolution we call pediomorphosis, where the adult looks like the juvenile. And yes, this is not a typo. This fish is almost a ½ meter long. And all of these ice fishes have this really salient feature that they lack hemoglobin. So their blood is white. All of their oxygen transport happens through passive diffusion. And we were able to decipher that the origin of losing their globin genes, their alpha and beta globin, makes the hemoglobin, was a result of several genomic lesions that may have actually involved a hybridization event a long, long time ago. Now, notothenoids also have a challenge in that, unlike most fish, they don't have a swim bladder. Swim bladder is a structure homologous to our lungs. Lungs are actually the ancestral state. Swim bladder is derived that fishes use to regulate their buoyancy, right? So think of it like having an inner tube inside of their body to help them float. Notothenoids ancestrally don't have a swim bladder, but yet notothenoids are ecologically diverse with regard to water column utilizations. So notothenoids have figured out, well, let's reduce our skeleton, let's make ourselves lighter. And some notothenoids have lipid deposits within and between their muscles that we don't see in any other vertebrate. So basically, let's reduce our skeleton and let's add a lot of lipid, give us some buoyancy. So what we're interested in doing is asking, how can we decipher the origin of these traits in the context of what we know about the climate history of Antarctica? And will that help us understand not only how has evolution worked in this group, but how evolution may work in other lineages? And so I don't have to say much about adaptive radiation. Mary Louise's introduction hit it right on the head. Adaptive radiation is a process where you're generating lineages in a short period of time. They're characterized by ecological and morphological differences. And these are some classic adaptive radiations. Those that might be most familiar to you are the famous Galapagos Darwin's finches. Now, in adaptive radiation, there's this idea that lineages can evolve a trait that allows them to utilize a set of habitats and resources that other lineages cannot. And so here with these Aquilegia flowers, columbines from the Pacific coast of North America, a sublineage has evolved these long nectar spurs that allows them to utilize a set of pollinators that other plants are not. And this is time calibrated. You can see that they're generating a lot of species in a short period of time. Now, it gets a little hairy. no pun intended, I'm talking about feathers here, when you're trying to decipher, is a trait adaptive or not? So we think of feathers and living birds as like, oh, that trait must have evolved to allow birds to fly. Well, what we know is that feathers have an origin that long predates powered flight. So this idea of a trait can be exaptive. An exaptation is that a trait is sitting there, it's around, and it's then co-opted for a novel use, as opposed to the trait produced directly by natural selection for a particular function, which we would call adaptation. So it becomes interesting to distinguish adaptation from exaptation. And with notothenioids, several traits that we're interested in exploring include the antifreeze glycoproteins, and then the mechanisms that allow them to be more buoyant in their habitats. Now, another concept often tied to adaptive radiation is this idea of ecological opportunity. And this is illustrated here. Let's say we have an emerging mountain range that just gives new habitat for lineages to start occupying, habitat that's not occupied by potential competitors. Classic example is with the Cretaceous Tertiary turnover, the extinction of large-bodied reptiles in terrestrial habitats, i.e. dinosaurs, that gave fodder for the radiation of placental mammals. So ecological opportunity is somewhat different from kind of key traits, but both together are thought to be important in adaptive radiation. Now, where ecological opportunity falls for these Antarctic fishes, I see it in two ways. One, I showed you how we had that turnover of a temperate fauna to just notothenioids. So all those niches opening up allows opportunity for notothenioids to diversify. But there's an ongoing process of the growth and retreat of grounded glaciers that are grounded on the continental shelf. By the way, the continental shelf is really narrow in Antarctica. It's the most narrow continental shelf on the planet. Fishes like continental shelves. Most fishes live on continental shelves. So we're like a fish fauna here, like we're chilling, we're having a good old time. We're literally chilling because we're in the Southern Ocean. And then this grounded shelf ice sheet comes along and bye-bye. Like the landlord says, rent's past due, you are evicted. It is over for that community. And it's thought that this has happened repeatedly at different times in different parts of the continent. And the idea is that when those glaciers then retreat, that's new shelf habitat for ecological opportunity. So we're interested in exploring how are these traits, adaptive or exaptive traits, playing out. We're interested in the tempo of evolution of these groups, but also what we're interested in is asking, can we relate periods of climate change to key ecological opportunities in the notothenioid radiation? And with this, we're going to take a functional genomic approach. And by functional genomic, what we're going to do is, first of all, we're going to infer like the best phylogeny for this group of fishes. So we're going to have a really good understanding of their evolutionary relationships and their divergence times. And then we're going to look for relations between the genotype and the phenotype. That is a genotype to phenotype relationship for these important traits. And what we're going to do with functional genomics is looking at bone density and how that relates to buoyancy, which allows some lineages to utilize midwater habitats. And then we're going to ask, can we discover these traits in the notothenioid genome, then can we replicate it in a model organism? That is, we're going to make a frankenfish. We're going to change the genotype of this fish to match that of the notothenioid. And then does it express a phenotype that we see in the Antarctic notothenioid? This is zebrafish, by the way. They're related to minnows. They are a minnow. And then with that, combining this in the context of our understanding of the evolutionary history of notothenioids, can we decipher adaptation, exaptation in the history of this group with regard to these key traits? And then can we bring in climate change and as an understanding as a speciation engine via ecological opportunity? So we went through and basically sequenced everything in the genome for about 50 notothenioid species. We're targeting all the protein coding regions. We have a bunch of non-coding regions that we sequenced, as well as ultra-conserved elements. And this just shows our coverage and depth if there's any genomics folks in the crowd. And what we're able to do is not only use another type of genomic data set to infer the phylogeny and divergence times, but what we're able to show is that the rate that species are generated in this group or lineages are generated in this group, we have two shifts. We have a shift leading to the Antarctic notothenioids, and we have a shift leading to this other group here called the plunder fishes. All right, this is going to be important a little bit later on, the fact we have these two shifts. Shifts are telling us two different things, by the way. We also said, let's look at the genomic data and look at it in the context of the time tree. And what we find is that there are periods of shift in the rate of change of the genome. So we have this kind of ho-hum rate ancestrally with these mostly non-Antarctic notothenioids, and we have a ho-hum rate for most of the Antarctic notothenioids. But in these ancestral parts of the phylogeny we're reconstructing, we're getting a very dramatically high rate of genomic evolution. What I'm showing you here is a frequency histogram showing the substitution rate, and we can see the substitution rate is very similar for a number of non-Antarctic and Antarctic notothenioids. But remember that species in yellow, the one that's in South America, sister to all the Antarctic notothenioids, as well as the reconstructed common ancestor of all the Antarctic notothenioids, has a really, really high substitution rate. And if anyone hears a molecular biology going, oh, that must be a lot, there must be a high rate of protein changing substitutions relative to non-protein changing substitutions, that's not the case. The rate of non-synonymous to synonymous substitutions is actually the same, even though the overall rate is higher. There's some genomic architecture, punctuated genomic architectural changes happening very early in the history of this group. But what we found is that a number of genes that are associated with the skeletal formation are under strong diversifying selection in notothenioids. So there's something going on. They're changing rapidly. And in fact, what we found is we're looking at here the phylogeny of the notothenioids, showing you the Antarctic group in blue, that sister lineage in yellow that's never been exposed to polar conditions. And you see a number of elements of the genome, exons for these skeletal development genes, are missing. They're gone. Well, what we then discovered is that if we look at bone density, so we're doing CT scanning and the hot colors show more dense bone, lighter, cooler colors, less dense bone. What we see is that the reduction of bone density, which is leading to the utilization of these midwater habitats, evolves prior to the origin of the Antarctic notothenioids. So the Antarctic notothenioids, in a sense, let's kind of make it a little more colloquial, were in a sense pre-adapted to utilize these midwater habitats before those midwater habitats opened up. It wasn't necessarily driven by utilizing those habitats. That trait was already there. So what we could do is we could take the genome from the notothenioids and we could use CRISPR-Cas9 to make that genome in the zebrafish model. And when we do that, we see that here's what a zebrafish normally looks like when it's allowed, when you're not mucking with its genome. And with our frankenfish that we put the notothenioid genome into, we find a phenotype in these the zebrafish that looks very similar to the phenotype that we're finding in these Antarctic notothenioids. So we feel confident we're making a good genotype-phenotype connection. So overall, what we're learning is that contingency, like these responses to historical accidents, as well as exaptation, not necessarily adaptation, are key to understanding the evolution of these Antarctic notothenioids. A number of these key traits evolved prior to the origin of being Antarctic, one of which is having bone density reduction, as well as this high rate of genomic evolution. What I'm showing you here is the speciation rate. So say you take the phylogeny and slice it through time versus the time before present, and we can see these key traits evolving before we get this elevated species diversification in the group. So also what we're learning is that these ice scouring events likely generate ecological opportunity via the opening of niches. This is my grad student here, Elise Parker. She gets the award and she has to run out of here and go give a talk at a grad student symposium. Thank you for being here, Elise. She put this really nice diagram together from a wonderful paper she published last year in American Naturalist. The idea here is that it's like a rinse-repeat cycle with Antarctic notothenioids. You have the establishment of a community, local extinction, the opening up of niches. And what we see as a signature of this pattern is this is a different time-calibrated phylogeny of the notothenioids, is that we find the most species-rich groups of notothenioids are really young. they're far younger than the onset of polar conditions. So there are mechanisms that are happening more contemporaneously that's driving the biodiversity of this group. Now, so we argue that climate change and repeated extinction of these nearshore benthic communities is providing a key set of ecological opportunities for speciation and ecological diversification. For the ecologists in the room, the impact on the Antarctic climate is so dramatic that it flips island biogeographic theory to where island archipelagos are actually the source for the biodiversity that we find in the nearshore continental regions of Antarctica. So one way to think of this is that the ancestral lineages of the Antarctic fishes occupy these areas around Antarctica and are the source for the Antarctic biodiversity that we see that's undergoing this rinse repeat cycle for ecological opportunity. So we're kind of leveraging notothenoids of a new way of thinking of studying adaptive radiation, where we're actually searching for genotype-phenotype relationships, and then utilizing that to really disentangle adaptation from exaptation. And just to summarize, we found that high rates of nucleotide evolution precede the Antarctic notothenoid adaptive radiation. The functional phylogenomics identifies a key genotype-phenotype relationship for the notothenoid radiation. And both the high rate of genomic evolution and the origin of the adaptive reduced bone density seems to precede the Antarctic radiation by about 20 million years. 20 million years before the origin and diversification of these Antarctic fishes. And so we're arguing that the role of exaptation is understudied in thinking about these iconic adaptive radiations, something that we need to start leveraging. And then finally, the fact that the Southern Ocean is warming. The Antarctic Peninsula is among the fastest warming regions in the world with regard to rate of warming. And this is the ancestral heart of the biodiversity of these Southern Ocean organisms and are imperiled due to ongoing current climate change. Thank you. I'll be happy to take any questions.
Tom?
Carla.
So is the implication that they just like radiate and get wiped out and then radiate and they just like evolve and re-evolve and re-evolve a bunch of times?
Right. Would you agree with that, Elise? Yeah, that was the kind of conclusion from her study that was published last year. So there's these iterative replicated radiations. And part of the reasoning, this was driven by Elise, was that, well, we're not seeing other groups come in and fill those niches, right? Because they're the only thing there. So if there was a situation where you had more kind of phylogenetic biodiversity, maybe it would be some other group that settled in. But the fact that the source remains this one, phylogenetic depauperon in a sense. Yes, sir.
Yes, thanks, Tom. It's amazing that the bone density adaptation started so much earlier than it was needed. It's fascinating.
Yes.
Is there a theory behind that? Do we know why?
We don't. We know a bit about the ecology of Elaginops maclevinus. It's called the Patagonian blenny, I believe is a common name. Looks nothing like a blenny. But my on-the-spot answer is just it's an evolutionary accident. It wasn't something that was necessarily deleterious. Genetic drift, things can become fixed in populations, or maybe there was some adaptation with regard to Elaginops. The common ancestor of Elaginops and the Antarctic notothenoids in these cold southern temperate habitats. Remains to be determined. Yeah, Mita.
I'm just so blown away by how cool these organisms are. So I'm going to ask an annoying functional morphology question.
Well, we know nothing about functional morphology, but we have a ton of fish in the museum, so come on on. Right?
I'm just wondering about these fish that lose their hemoglobin.
Oh.
44 centimeter fish.
Yes.
How do you get them to pass?
Yeah, so these ice fishes are all scaleless. That's one way. They have their capillaries, they have a lot of capillaries packed at their body surface. They have the highest cardiac output of any nototheniod. They have the largest volume of occupancy of the heart. So there seem to be these compensatory changes. Just to show you how not adaptive I am in terms of my philosophy, there are people that argue that was adaptive, that blood has so viscous at that cold temperature that one way of really reducing viscosity is getting rid of your proteins. So yeah, you're rolling your eyes. I agree. But that argument is out there. Again, I think it's probably more just an accident. And that's the only place on the planet you could have that. Is the only place you could not have hemoglobin as a vertebrate in the Southern Ocean because the cold temperature, the water is saturated with oxygen. Yeah.
Can I ask
Yeah.
a follow-up question? My student might be wondering the same thing. She's studying oxygen at the ice-ocean interface, Ashley. And so the question, I guess, is how sensitive do you think these fish are to changes in water column oxygen levels?
I don't know. That's a really great question. That's a really great question. I don't know. Yeah.
Because she's finding significant reductions in oxygen. We're talking in the Arctic.
Well, that would be troubling for the Southern Ocean. So, yeah, Chase.
Often think about key innovation, right? Things that organisms are lucky to have and I wonder if this data or data set, particularly replicated rate, you think that maybe it's perhaps less about that and more about these things evolved at the right time that it wouldn't be destroyed by extinction right in the short term, and that later would be not only whether they have a feature that is later adapted, but
Right.
develop that relative to extinction. You think that is a role?
Yeah, so I guess what Chase asking for the viewers at home is that he is basically saying, so I would, is it not just the origin of these exaptive traits, but is it the timing of their origin? It could be. And that's why I use the term contingency, right? And so in evolutionary biology, there's a debate that's not really a debate, but it's pitched as a debate, that the idea that if you replayed the tape of life all over again, you would have arthropods and vertebrates and photosynthetic green plants, et cetera. But there's another argument that, well, much of life responds to accidents. So if you did play the tape back, we wouldn't have photosynthetic green plants. We wouldn't have arthropods. We wouldn't have vertebrates. And so I think it gets into that as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mary Louise, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm so happy that Climate Day this year is about oceans because like Chelly and others, I think our planet should be called Planet Ocean, not Planet Earth, and for all the reasons we've been talking about today, but especially because we depend on them for a number of things. And as we've heard already today, oceans regulate our climate, they affect our weather patterns, they host a vast variety of biodiversity, and they provide up to about 50% of our oxygen, so we need them for that. My talk a bit today will focus more on the nutrition side of things, and that we depend on the oceans a lot for protein, and they also support livelihoods. I'll talk a bit about fishing in the part of the world that I work in. And as we all know, we're here today because we're thinking about how the oceans are warming. So the part of the world that I have done a lot of work in since my time as a PhD student is the Bering Sea. And as you can see, it's located in between the state of Alaska and Russia. And most of the Bering Sea is underneath the ocean. There is a broad continental shelf. And to the north is the Bering Strait. And to the south of it is the Aleutian Island chain with a deeper basin off the continental shelf. This area, as you can see from this satellite image, is green for a lot of the year. It's a very productive part of the world. And what's making up this green that's reflecting the color in the satellite image are lots of microscopic plankton, such as these diatoms shown here. This base of the food web here supports a really amazing array of marine communities. This is a very typical feeding flock that I studied for my PhD that I did mostly on seabirds. But underneath this feeding flock are a very dense aggregation of euphausiids or krill, and these birds here. This is called a shearwater, and they actually migrate all the way from New Zealand to the Bering Sea every year just to feast on this amount of production that's being provided here by the krill. And then in the middle there, you can see is a humpback whale also gouging down on the krill. And so this is a very amazing amount of productivity coming in through these marine communities, marine food webs, but they're also supporting these really important fisheries. What we're looking at here is the walleye pollock and also Pacific cod, which make up the groundfish fisheries that are very important in this area. Another important fishery are a number of different crab species, such as this snow crab. Now, because of these very productive fisheries, the ports in Alaska are always at the top of the list when it comes to production. And here we're looking at the amount of volume and dollars, that come into these ports and dollars. So on the order of, several hundred millions of pounds and, hundreds of millions of dollars each year, coming into these ports. And most of this is coming in through the pollock fishery, which was that fish I showed you on the previous slide, but these are trawled by bottom nets and are quite a lucrative fish. And you probably, if you've had like a fish sandwich or that fake crab that comes in your sushi, that's all pollock. So we eat a lot of pollock here because it's such an abundant fish. Sorry. This part of the world is also very important to a number of people who live around the Bering Sea. This plot is showing you the map of Alaska, and each pie chart shows you a number of people who live in Alaska. There's, most of cities have the largest numbers, but you can see all dotted along the coasts are small communities that are made up of mostly Native Alaskans who live there, and they spend a lot of their time looking for food out on the ocean. And so the production that the Bering Sea provides is very important for them because they live in very remote parts of the world where, getting food is very important. Now, I've been part of just one of many, many people working in the Bering Sea who have been seeing changes in this ecosystem over decades. And some of these things you'll see today, but there's been very dramatic changes in water temperature, changes in sea ice cover, changes in the timing of the spring bloom that I'll tell you about, fluctuations in zooplankton biomass, and also fluctuations in jellyfish. And this is what I've been focusing on lately, is how jellyfish fit into all of these changes that have been observed currently in the system. Now, why jellyfish? Well, not only are they kind of cool, but they are part of the ecosystem, and they are feeding on parts of the food webs that people care about. For example, they feed on young stages of fish, and they also feed on zooplankton. So they turn out that they are important predators and competitors of fish. So here's a simplified Bering Sea food web. I'll show you that it's a lot more complex than that. But basically, you have this base of the food chain, phytoplankton, which supports the zooplankton in the system. And then this zooplankton then supports both the fish larvae and then forage fish. And forage fish are very important in supporting the higher trophic levels, especially the commercial fish that I mentioned earlier. And these forage fish are a very important link that are linking the base of the food web to these higher trophic levels. But when you look at these basic food web models, a lot of them don't take into account what jellyfish are doing in that system. Over the years, people have kind of ignored jellyfish, have not considered them in food web models. If they collect them in fish nets, they tend to just throw them out. But in the work that I and my colleagues have been doing, we've been trying to fill this knowledge gap by trying to understand how forage fish and other parts of the ecosystem are impacted by jellyfish when they are present. And one of the things I've done with my collaborator, Jim Rusica, is to look at how energy flows through the food web by noting where it flows through different nodes in this. This is a more realistic look at the Bering Sea food web. And we consider what happens when energy flows through different nodes. And here on this side, we're considering energy as it throws through large jellyfish. And on the left side, we consider energy coming up through phytoplankton, going through forage fish. And what you can just kind of see just by looking at the colors here, large jellyfish are drawing a lot of the phytoplankton from the base of the food web, but very little of that energy is passed to the upper part of the food web because not a lot of things eat jellyfish. On the other side with forage fish, they are also drawing up some amount of phytoplankton, but they're passing a lot more energy to the top of the food web because there's a lot of things that eat forage fish. And so in these models, we can look at how much energy is drawn from the base, which is the footprint, and then how much energy is passed to the top, which is called the reach in this kind of model. And then because in our system, jellyfish fluctuate in terms of their abundance and biomass, we can force these models during different regimes of low jellyfish biomass and high jellyfish biomass. And I'll get back to these fluctuations in a bit. But then if we force that model, that trophic model, here, this is the results of what happens to the rest of the food web during a low jellyfish year or low jellyfish regime. And as you can see, compared to the kind of baseline at 0 here, almost all parts of the food web go up in terms of their biomass, with the exception of this one strange one down here. Anybody have a thought about why that might be, why that one might go down? Here's the audience participation card. Why might this fish go down? Sablefish. Anybody know sablefish? Turns out it eats jellyfish. It's one of the only ones in this system that does. So its numbers go down when jellyfish are low, but everything goes up. And then the reverse is true when we force the system with more jellyfish in the system. Sablefish are very happy, but the rest of the community, their biomass goes down. And that's because the energy, again, is not being passed up to the top of the food web. And this is kind of summarizing these simulations, showing you that in a low jellyfish year, there's a lot of biomass of forage fish, pelagic fish, and other fish, but these amounts go down when jellyfish are high in the system. Okay, so so you may have heard that jellyfish are taking over the world. Has anybody heard that? Okay, okay. There are some hypothesized reasons for why that might be. That's another lecture, but I say that jellyfish are actually fluctuating, and in some places they may be on the increase. The hypothesized reasons for these increases are shown here. In many communities or many waters, we have a lot of built structure like oil rigs, docks, and things like that. This top picture is showing you the sessile part of the life cycle of jellyfish. It actually has to be attached to something, and then it releases its little medusae. They're all stacked up there, and when they release, then they grow up to be these large jellyfish. So some people hypothesize that having more underwater structures around provides more habitat for jellies, and that's a possibility. Probably not what's happening in the Bering Sea because there's no underwater structures. Fishing can remove predators, such as other planktivorous fish, and this has been shown only in one place to be occurring, in the Benguela Current, where a lot of sardines were removed. They also eat zooplankton. The jellyfish came in and kind of took over that system. Species introductions, also in the Black Sea, an invader, ctenophore, has also taken off in that system. Eutrophication, the idea there is that with cloudy water, a fish that needs visual cues in order to forage will not do well in a cloudy water column, whereas something without eyes might do just fine. Climate change is also hypothesized to affect jellies, and this is the area of research that I've been focusing on for my work. And I've been able to look at long time series to look at climate impacts on jellies, thanks to my colleagues who work at NOAA Fisheries. And what they've been doing is that since 1982, they've been doing these systematic fisheries trawls all in the same location over a grid since the early 1980s. And they pull up mostly fish, but as you can see here, there's a lot of jellies in here. Now, there are many species of jellies in the Bering Sea, but this one holds up really well in a fish trawl, so we've been studying this one. This is the study area. You can see there's quite a number of trawls, 400 each year from the early 70s to present. I don't know if anybody's seen the show, The Deadliest Catch. There's two episodes called Slime Bank, and this is this area right here where the jellyfish tend to be very, very dense. And they've been around there for a long time. If you look at these old logs from the U.S. Fish Commission, they've been around at least since the 1980s, where they describe something that looks very much like this main species that we focus on. Here's the data that has been collected by National Marine Fisheries. And what we've done here is we're looking at biomass index. This is what comes up in the trawl every year. And we've looked at these two parts of the middle shelf, and this is their whole survey area. But the middle shelf is where we have the most jellies. We've been looking at changes over time here. And my colleague Rick Broder and I decided to look at this because, you know, he was kind of watching. He's like, these jellies are kind of going through the roof here. What's going on? We watched it for a while, and then it crashed, and we kind of wondered what was happening. At the same time, there are a lot of people looking at what's happening with other climatic changes and other, you know, water temperature, ice changes in production. So we decided to study this to try to understand what was going on with the jellies and how they fit in. So we took these data and took a generalized additive modeling approach where we looked at these two different areas side by side, and we compared the biomass in these areas and then ran models to understand both the physical and biological correlates of the jellyfish biomass. And so you can see we took our dependent variable here was the jellyfish biomass for those two regions, a whole slew of physical parameters, trying to understand what the physical drivers might be here. So temperature from different seasons, wind of various types, climate variables, currents, also thinking about how they were being transported through the system, and also ice cover. In addition, we also looked at biological variables such as zooplankton and fish biomass. And then our best models are shown here for the Southeast model. A big driver is the biomass lag in our system. So if you have jellyfish high in one year, they leave a lot of young. They also reproduce sexually, and they produce larvae that then settle and create new jelly. So we have to include the lag in there. But then we also have these other climate variables that are also important. And likewise for the Northwest model. Without getting into the details of all these drivers, we're happy that our models, a combination of both biological and physical parameters, were telling us that we can get pretty good explanatory power with these models. And just to summarize what the favorable conditions are for jellyfish up there, we found that heavy ice sea ice cover was very important. Also, the presence of high zooplankton production. And these are these very large copepods here. You can see this is really chock full of oil and a very good prey item for these jellies. Something that we didn't study directly, but we know that happens when you have heavy sea ice cover, you get an early ice edge bloom, which I'll explain to you why that's important. But we think that that's the causative link. And when you have sea ice cover, you have high zooplankton production in the system. A bit more about how this is working is that when you have this sea ice in winter here, so this is, you have very low light here, so it's very cold. As you warm up into spring, you begin to have these melt ponds that form at the edge. This creates a what's called a freshwater lens right at the edge there. And that stratification allows for the phytoplankton that are in a somewhat light limited situation. With stratification, they're held closer to the sun so they can then start to bloom. This creates a really dense area of phytoplankton right at the ice edge. And you can see what I mean by a thin layer of fresh cold water here. This is a thermocline that's in just the upper couple meters of the ocean, and a strong halocline. This is cold, fresh water right at the surface, and you can see that there's a phytoplankton bloom right at that edge as well. Now, this also then is important not just to the planktonic animals here, but this amount of production settles down to the floor here, to the ocean floor, supporting a very dense population of shellfish, crabs. Those, pollock and cod are all going to be feeding on these things as well. So this is important not just to the planktonic organisms, but also to the benthic organisms on the bottom. So here's a conceptual model of probably what's happening here in, and this is this is very embarrassing. This is proposed by my PhD advisor, my former PhD advisor, but I forgot to put his name on here, so don't do that. If you're, this is Hunt et al., who, there's tens of people working on this, and I really should cite their work, but this is really the hypothesis now that's being tested up there to understand what's driving the productivity in the system. And what they think is happening is when you have, I'll talk about the late ice retreat first, is like when the ice hangs out in the system for some time, like into April, you can see that there's sun present in the system at that point. Again, that creates that stratification, which provides the opportunity for those phytoplankton to stay close to the sun so they can then bloom and create an increase in their biomass. This provides a lot of food early in the season, which is really important for especially these large Calanus copepods that just come out of hibernation at this time. And if they have abundant food at this time, they can grow and they end up with a very large biomass that persists throughout the summer. But when you have low ice in the system, when you have a warm year where ice has retreated early or is not present, this open water community doesn't have that stratification, so the water is being mixed, and that does not provide the conditions that will support a bloom early in the season. So these big fat copepods don't get the food that they need at the time that they need it. So there's a mismatch in their needs. What you do see though is a later open water bloom in summer, which is great. It provides food, but for a different kind of copepod, for a small copepod that is not as nutritious for many things in the system. It's also arriving very late at a time where the critical conditions have passed, where some things really need it. So this is the working hypothesis for how sea ice really drives productivity up there. And I'm going to show you some evidence here that kind of shows you what's going on with the zooplankton. Here's the ice retreat being measured at this location here. And it's looking at whether it hangs out late. So this would be a cold year when it hangs out late, or it retreats early or is absent. And so in a warm year, you'll have very early ice retreat, and it hangs out during a cold year. And we see very different communities of zooplankton that are present in the cold year. We see these big fat Calanus copepods with lots of oil droplets, or we see these large krill. Okay, so time goes on, and I'm working along it here at Yale, but my friends out in Alaska are still out there collecting all this data. And, then we see yet another increase and another decrease in jellyfish. So now we're like, okay, this is cool. Let's go back and see if we can use our models in similar ways to then try to understand what's happening with the second peak and decline. And so we used our same models again, although we had to omit our biological variables, and we did that for a couple of reasons. The first reason, we said, well, we can take a scientific approach, and many of the biological and physical variables are correlated, and it's actually better if you can, perhaps use an index instead of depending on the biological samples. Also, a lot of the zooplankton monitoring had stopped, which is an issue with many of these systems, is that it's hard to do these long time series with things like zooplankton. It's very time consuming to sit there and identify each one. It's very expensive to go out and get it. So we said, let's see if we could use these physical variables because they're more readily available. So we rerun our models with just these physical parameters, and we ended up getting pretty good explanatory power on our model output, and likewise for the Northwest model. So this was even with the biological variables, we were able to, see a trend in these different climatic patterns that we're having. And we were able to then hindcast our models and show that we have a very good fit for the jellyfish biomass for the whole time series. So I know these are just correlative studies, but at least we hope that these kinds of models can be used to help us at least, understand some of what's happening with climate-induced changes in the system. And I should also say that jellyfish, as well as many other parameters, are used in the fisheries management process, where they try to understand what's happening in the system as a whole. And jellyfish are used as an ecosystem indicator. So in addition to their biomass going up and down, they're also moving north, as many species are. These are these same data, but now looking across the shelf. So here's the earliest time series up here. This is the notorious slime bank is right there, and you can see as the population increases, it seems to have perhaps seeded some other areas. Remember those little polyps? We hypothesized that the polyps are along this slime bank, these islands here, little rocky outcrops, which would be good habitat for them. There's also some very small islands that there appear to also be hotbeds for jellyfish biomass. So it could be that they've established new polyp colonies up here. Now, as these organisms are moving to the north, these National Marine Fisheries surveys are also having to move north. This is the survey area that I've worked in, which has been done, as I said, since the early 80s. Only recently have they started to have to monitor this part of the ocean because all the fish are moving north. And so the first time they monitored this area was in 2010, and just looking at the jellyfish here, but you can also look at other fish data as well. It went back the second time in 2017 and saw a 400% increase in jellies. And I've talked to people up here. This is close to Nome, Alaska, where I know people who work up there, and they said they've never seen jellyfish up there. So this was a kind of a dramatic event. So just some take-home messages. I'm going to go on a little bit more, but just some take-home messages just from my research. We see these trophic simulations show us that jellyfish abundance changes can have impacts through the food web. I showed you that at least in this part of the world, jellyfish fluctuate in terms of their biomass, and they're shifting northward as many other fish species are too. We have pretty good success with being able to understand their ups and downs with current variables. I'm sorry, with physical variables, in particular, now looking at that longer time series, we have a pretty good handle on the physical drivers of their abundance. And especially that, we hope that using these kinds of tools, we can help to understand these climate-induced changes that we're seeing. But to come back now to sea ice cover for a bit, this is the time series that I used in my model. So from 1982 to 2017, and as you can see, what this is a picture of the sea ice that kind of average sea ice that you would see in summer in winter in satellites. And this index here is showing that you have periods of very heavy ice cover for a number of years, and then periods of cool ice cover. And this has been kind of the typical scenario up there, kind of they call them stanzas. So this would be a cold stanza, and this would be a warm stanza. And these are the climate shifts or climate regime shifts I talked about earlier. But it seems like we're moving into a very radically different climate condition in the last couple of years. So here's the end of that time series I just showed you is 2013, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. So you can see there's some moderate amount of sea ice covering the shelf here, but we get to 2018, which was just completely devoid of sea ice, which really surprised a lot of people when it was happening. It was related to very warm conditions that were happening in the Pacific that had eventually, moved north and warmed that part of the world as well. And what's interesting about this is that, when you talk to people about it, it's like, well, we knew this was going to happen based on what climate models were telling us, but it's happening a lot sooner than what was expected. So climate models were predicting this would be happening in the 30s, but it's happening now. So a reminder of this, ice edge bloom situation where you have, this then sedimentation from the bloom, which is feeding this, dense community on the shelf. So remember, I talked about the production part. What I haven't talked about yet is how that changes the thermal environment of the shelf. This is showing you bottom water temperature on the shelf in different years. So this is the mean at the top. 2012 is one very heavy ice year, so that would be in one of those cold stanzas. And down here is 2018, which is that really almost ice-free year. And so we're not looking at ice here, but this is the remnant of the ice. This is when it melts, it forms this cold water that then settles on the bottom, forming the cold pool. So the thermal conditions of the shelf are really changing. And this is affecting the things that live there. This is showing you again in black would be the bottom temperature of the cold pool. So black is following the outline of the cold pool, showing you 2010, which has some cold pool, very little in 2017 and nothing in 2018. So again, loss of the cold pool, but what you see is a change in the fish and invertebrates that live there. So the Arctic are the blue species, mixed are light green, and dark green are boreal species. And what you see is this kind of, loss of the Arctic species on the surveys being replaced by boreal species. And this is a process that's been called borealization. Now, the poster child for borealization these days is the snow crab. And if you've seen this snow crab in the news, you've seen a lot of headlines talking about how the fisheries are closed, the fishing boats are having to go north to catch them. And basically they saw a very dramatic shift in the distribution of these crabs and very dramatic losses in the numbers of crabs. And basically, you probably have seen headlines, fish disappear or crabs disappeared. And what they think is going on is that they've been sort of steadily moving north, like what I've seen with the jellyfish and other fish. They're steadily moving north and kind of following that cold pool. And they're kind of, in warmer, there's kind of a few different hypotheses of what they think is going on here. It could be that in warmer waters, their metabolism is increasing to the point where they have to feed more. And so one hypothesis is they're not getting enough food because they're starving. The other hypothesis is their prey or their predators, which are Pacific cod, are coming from the south, and also feeding more because their metabolism is going up, and so they're being fed on. And the third hypothesis is that they're heading up into these northern waters where their larvae are being transported up out of the area, out of their habitat. So for all these reasons, and because their numbers were crashing, these fisheries closed for the last couple of years. So just to kind of bring this back to food security for a bit, this has been in the news a lot. This amount of warming that's been observed here in Alaska has been extreme in the last couple of years, and we have to definitely think about what this means. I know that these fish, I think in the long run they'll probably they'll evolve and we'll have radiations and we'll be okay. But at least for the short term, we have to think about people's livelihoods and people's food security in this particular system. So with that, I'll just say thanks to my collaborators and thank you for listening.
Thanks, Rita.
Welcome.
Questions? Start us off.
Sure.
Then those main jellies that you were capturing or measuring in the trawls, what are the depth levels that they live?
Yeah, good question. So they're on the shelf, and they tend to aggregate in the middle, kind of around the thermocline, around 30 meters. This is a bottom trawl, but when they bring the net up, it comes through the jellyfish layer. So they're pretty much diffused through the whole water column, but most of them are at the thermocline.
Okay, and then what about transport? Do you see transport through Bering Strait? Are they largely affected, or do they?
So we've done some circulation studies with them, and we've put little drifters along the chain, the island chain, and they follow the shelf break, and they go out of our study area. So they do drift, to the north. This species also occurs in the Arctic, but it's not. It's very, very small in terms of the abundance compared to here. But there are a few individuals in the Arctic up there. So it's possible that they will increase in the Arctic. We just haven't seen the large fluctuations. Well, at the same time, we're not really monitoring them as closely either. But yeah.
Because if they mostly drift, then that's quite a strong volume transport through Bering Strait, which is actually increasing as well.
That's interesting. They probably don't overwinter but their polyps do live from year to year.
Any more questions? Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you.
All right, our last.
Thank you for inviting me today. I think it's really exciting to have a climate day that's an ocean climate day. And so now I'm going to talk about something kind of different than what we've been hearing, because I'm going to focus on something I've been thinking a lot about for the last number of years, which is the ocean economy, and how do we connect all of the science that we've been hearing with sort of economic activities, and how do we do the measurement for that? There we go. A little bit of lag. Okay, so let me motivate this with it. This has actually become a very, very big deal and a very hot topic. On the international front, the OECD has an ocean economy plan that runs through 2030. Development banks, for example, the Asian Development Bank has been developing what it calls blue bonds. And these are bonds where they're blending financial instruments with traditional money to maybe build a water treatment facility that a municipality or a city might ask for, with conservation requirements for like restoring seagrasses or mangroves. And they're able to do this by taking money, basically philanthropic money, and blending it with traditional finance money to make these projects cheaper and more plentiful. And this is a big push at the Asian Development Bank, among other sort of development financing institutions. The IMF has been leaning into what it calls debt for nature or debt for climate swaps. Many of these have focused on blue carbon. Kristalina Georgiovanni, who is the executive director or some such thing at the IMF, basically like the top person, has been doing these very largely focused on the ocean. The most recent one I'm aware of was with the Bahamas, and effectively taking the Bahamas sovereign debt and converting it into seagrass conservation. So a lot of hot stuff going on there. If you weren't tracking, a few years back, 14 heads of state got together to launch something called the High Level Panel for the Sustainable Ocean Economy. In the last few years, 3 other countries have joined, including the US. So President Biden is technically the representative on that panel. The person who actually shows up for him is someone many of you might know, which is Jan Lubchenco. But the countries involved with that cover 50% of global coastlines and even more of the EEZs in the world. And again, this is not focused on just pure ocean conservation, but it really is about how does the ocean economy become a sustainable ocean economy? So there's both conservation and ocean development. Last summer, after a lot of delays, that the UN had its big ocean conference. One of the key things that came out of the Lisbon Declaration was a commitment to marine natural capital and decision-making largely focused on sustainable ocean economies. When we were there, I ran a side event where we had, I believe, 7 or 8 ministers from various countries speaking about the accounting for the ocean economy and doing the measurement for the ocean economy. And the G7 environment ministers communique just came out, and there's a whole bunch of ocean stuff in there. And there's a whole bunch of sustainable economic development and environmental sustainable economic development in there, particularly around measuring natural capital, including ocean natural capital. On the domestic policy front, there's also a lot of action. I don't know if people are aware, but in March, the administration put out its Ocean Climate Action Plan. They call this OCAP. And one of the pieces of this is sustainable ocean. This is developing a sustainable ocean economy. This is in line with the U.S. commitments to the High Level Panel for a Sustainable Ocean Economy, and developing a national plan for a sustainable ocean economy, and also directing agencies to put money in their budgets to help develop a sustainable ocean economy. And then the new Blue Economy Initiative at NOAA happens to be one of Administrator Spinrad's pet projects, and is very interested in, Administrator Spinrad specifically is very interested in how ocean exploration and ocean technologies can both conserve the ocean and spur economic development. So there's a lot of interest in making the ocean a more visible and more active part of economic development, and in doing that in a sustainable way that protects ocean ecosystems and ocean processes, and also understands that the ocean is, a big part of the climate system and at risk from climate change, and also potentially a solution to a contributing. So I don't know that there's one solution, but a contributing solution to climate change. But I think, what gets measured gets done. So how are we at measuring this? And this is something that I spend a lot of time thinking about. In the US, we have a marine economy satellite account. This has been developed. This has been produced twice by the Bureau of Economic Analysis. This is the same bureau that produces our main GDP statistics. They have dated it back to 2014 through 2020. Here, unfortunately, somebody who does not do communications very well made the marine economy orange and the rest of the economy blue, just to confuse everyone. And so you're looking at changes here and basically the percent changes in the marine economy relative to the overall economy between 2019 and 2020. And what we know is that marine economic activities were actually hit fairly hard by the COVID pandemic. And this is, of course, a lousy year to be doing comparisons for, but it's the one that they had on their website. So that's what I grabbed. So this really looks at marine production. It looks at how do we take resources out of the ocean and turn them into spending money, and how do we create jobs, right? It doesn't think about the wealth that's in the ocean. It doesn't think about the ocean as a trust fund or a way of sort of sustainable long run production or well-being for people. Earlier this year as well, the Biden-Harris administration put out a plan to develop statistics, natural capital accounts and environmental economic statistics. One of the interesting sections in that report, or that national strategy, is it adds a ocean or marine natural capital account. And unlike any of the other sort of environmental topics addressed in that strategy, it's actually addressed throughout the entire plan in 3 phases of recognizing that actually accounting for the ocean economy is a big task, and accounting for natural capital in the ocean is a big task. So why do we really need to do this anyway? Like I sort of said, people are interested in the ocean economy. We're sort of doing some measurement. There's sort of 3 things that we can really think about measuring. One is we can think about the kinds of numbers that show up in the Wall Street Journal, right? How much money how many resources are we mobilizing out of the ocean, converting that into money, and measuring that in terms of things like jobs, right? This is how much can we consume from the ocean. This is what we've tended to focus on in sort of macroeconomic decision making. These are like, how big should the budget be? What should the central bank be doing? The ocean's going to, at least for the foreseeable future, be a small part of that. And I'm not sure that this is the most important sphere, but it's the one that the statisticians doing this work are most familiar with. Another area that I think many people are very concerned about, which is how is what we are extracting from the ocean or generating from the ocean being distributed, and is there sort of an equitable distribution? And we are just learning how to measure that. And then what I spend most of my time thinking about is the purple sphere over here, which is how do we measure the wealth that's stored in the ocean and ask, is that trust fund, like, is it going up or is it going down, right? And how do we, and then what does that mean for policy? So the reason we need these measurements is not because Treasury is going to somehow say that the federal budget should be a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller because of what's going on in the ocean, or the central bank is going to be doing something fundamentally different. It's because we use these sorts of statistics to craft a national narrative about our relationship with the ocean. It's a narrative that lots of decision makers, bankers, people with resources can understand. And it's a lot about storytelling, but storytelling grounded in sort of commonly agreed facts. It is also the underpinning for some of these new policy instruments that we're seeing emerge in the ocean economy space. The debt swaps that I talked about, like with the Bahamas, there's a bunch of new insurance programs related to the ocean that I'll talk about in a few minutes if you're not aware of. And then a lot of these data actually go into the kinds of models that regional planners use to think about planning. So for coastal communities, no surprise, in the US, most of the population lives like pretty close to a coast, right? There are lots of cities on coast. The kinds of models that they use for development pull from these sorts of data. And what they do is they pull the economic data, and then if we're lucky, they run around and pull some environmental data and kind of mash it together. And the whole idea here is to have a data set where some of that crosstalk is already working. So if you're going to do one, it's just as easy to do the other, and that we actually start to understand some of the environmental trade-offs with the economic trade-offs as we think about development in the coastal and ocean space. So I don't know what was in the introduction. Part of the reason I know about what's going on in policy right now is I just came back from spending about 1.5 years at the White House. Arthi Prabhakar, who is the head of OSTP, was my boss. And Arthi liked to ask us, what's it going to take? And so I thought I should be answered. I thought that was always a good question to be thinking about. And so, as I've said, it's like we don't need ocean GDP. What we need is a set of ocean economic statistics to really understand how this is changing, to craft narratives, to use in regional planning models, to think about financing, to understand, are we wealthier for the way that we're managing our ocean, or are we poorer? That's like the big question. And these statistics don't tell you what questions to ask, but they can help you guide your way through them. It turns out that most of the ocean accounts that do exist, and I'm going to show you a few in a few moments, they don't hold all the answers. Surprise, surprise. They're not great at distribution. They're not great at sustainability questions yet, but the concepts exist. So what's actually nice is there are holes in the accounts. So what does this mean? It means there are some blind spots in what we're doing and what we should be doing, but we kind of know what we need to do. The scientific world has changed so rapidly since people started thinking about this 10, 15 years ago that there's really a lot of catch up of how to organize the data, how to actually do the work and fill some of those holes. But I think it's far better, like when you've built the room and you don't have the furniture in it yet, that you know you've got the room, right? This is always a problem at a university. But you've got the room, it's there, it's built. And that's kind of where we are with it, with our sort of national economic accounting. It turns out many forms of ocean natural capital, at least that which would be in exclusive economic zone, are already in scope for either production or balance sheets in our national statistics. They're just not done. The data haven't been organized. They've been deprioritized for various reasons. But lots of ocean, and so that is really the challenge. So what I would say is, like, we're 70% there to agreeing what needs to be done to measure a sustainable ocean economy. Now we need to go do that. And there's probably like 30% of stuff that still needs more input and changes to sort of the standards, which are constantly evolving and being updated. So the international standards are guided by this thing called the System of National Accounts. Connected to the System of National Accounts is a program called the System of Environmental Economic Accounts. Within that, there's something called the Central Framework, which directly links to the System of National Accounts. And the System of National Accounts is what, like, you know, dyed in the wool sort of economic analysts. These are what produce GDP, right? There's nothing particularly sustainability or environmental about these. So I like to start there rather than, but there's also something called an ecosystem account connected to the SIA program that's also evolving. So what's supposed to be there? I just said that there are holes. There's like a space. There's a room to put this stuff already. It's not that we are completely blind to it. We're just not doing it. So what's there? So it turns out any ocean-related activity that generates a monetary exchange, in theory, is supposed to be in our national economic accounts. This has some pluses and minuses. So it includes things like, you know, the harvest fisheries that we were just hearing about, like the pollock we were just hearing about. Clearly, they go into GDP. Tourism, transportation. Okay, so right there we have this problem. I have seen numerous ocean economy reports that say how important the ocean is because we have to see it for protecting ocean biodiversity or ocean climate regulation. And because the ocean economy is so big and you pull apart the numbers and it's 80% transoceanic shipping, I'm not sure those are like the right measures. So interpreting an ocean account is challenging because of this. Another challenge is that illegal or IUU fishing actually enters GDP. Smuggling actually enters GDP. If these, you know, assuming that these products ultimately make it into a monetary exchange product stream that's not like fully black market, even if it's a gray market type thing, it's going to make it into GDP. So we're boosting GDP with IUU fishing. And if people are tracking, another big thing that happened in the world last year was there's a big international agreement to combat IUU fishing. So we're spending a lot of money that goes into GDP to combat these things, and sort of like they're going up together because, and this is one of the challenges of deconflicting some of this accounting. And I think the ocean is bringing that into focus. Another area that we just heard about in the last talk that's really important in a lot of countries is subsistence harvesting. Technically, subsistence harvesting is supposed to be measured. It's very hard to measure. So while it's supposed to be there, it often doesn't make it into lots of countries' accounts, including the US accounts, as far as I understand. What's really fascinating is that most biological assets that can contribute to harvesting or other future monetary exchanges have a place on the balance sheet. And guess what example they actually use? Marine capture fisheries, even though the US doesn't put them on their balance sheet yet. Like, this is like one of the first things NOAA's planning on doing with the new strategy. But that's actually the example is wild capture fisheries managed with a quota-like system in EEZs are clearly balance sheets biologic. That is the example of a biological asset that the international guidance provides. So fish stocks should be in. So I started asking questions about coral because to like a statistician or an economist, corals are fish. right? Like they're this, I know somebody in here just like totally flipped out because I said that, but like from the standpoint of how they would think about these things, like they're really not that different, right? And I guess that's true if you're comparing it to like an airplane, right? And so I asked about corals, and basically I was told, well, you know, if you're harvesting corals for aquaculture trade, yeah, maybe, but that's a small thing. It doesn't really matter, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, well, what about, you know, the services that corals provide in situ in the ocean, right? It's like, no, those don't count. There's no monetary exchange. And so I say that I was actually talking to some of the System of National Accounts is being revised right now, talking to one of the lead editors about this. And I said to him, so look, we've got these big coral reefs in the Caribbean right now. And Swiss Re and AXA XL, these are two big insurance providers, have gone out and written very large insurance policies with Belize and some other corporates in Latin America, insuring the reef itself, right? And I said, oh, so what are they insuring? They're ensuring future revenue streams from the tourism industries in these countries, right? This is very much a productive input into tourism, and the insurance industry is recognizing that and writing insurance policies along this, right? So they are clearly, so if we see market transactions insuring future streams of income related to reefs, then clearly they are a productive asset that falls within our national accounts. And basically I got told, yep, that sounds right. Now we got to go convince like these accountants who frankly like to caricaturize the world, right? They don't want to deal with the messiness of the science, and the science has advanced so far, and we understand these connections so much better. And the importance of doing this is sort of communicating through these other pathways to people that we, you know, as scientists, we're not necessarily used to talking to. But, you know, I was pretty shocked when he basically folded and said, yeah, that seems like a pretty compelling reason that we should be thinking about reefs as productive assets. So the challenge then is we're really good at doing this right now in sort of anecdotes. And I will show you, if we have time, I'll show you one anecdote related to the Baltic Sea in a few moments. We're not so great at scaling this up. We're not so great at being able to repeat these measurements over time. And I think in science, we're very interested in the replicability of our results, but not necessarily interested in doing the same experiment over and over and over again. And the problem with a lot of the statistical measurement is fundamentally about doing it over and over and over again. So making sure that the science that's being used is robust and can actually be repeated at scale. And as one of my colleagues in the White House, I like to say, like in the case of ocean, it'd be like without creating a full employment program for people studying the ocean. Like it's got to be able to be done at scale at reasonable cost. And I think for us as scientists, what that means is thinking a bit further downstream than we're used to. Now that the world is interested in like taking the scientific data, not just to answer a hypothesis, but to actually regularly monitor, regularly connect the natural environment to the economy, to the climate, to the economy, being able to take our science and take it a few steps further down the R&D pipeline to make it easier for governments, accountants, non-scientists to actually just replicate over and over again. So real quick, to sort of give you another state. So I led a working group for the high-level panel for the sustainable ocean economy on ocean accounting a few years back. This was before the US, the UK, and France joined the high-level panel. Tried to do some breakdowns of what folks were doing. Turns out people measure fisheries really well. I learned from colleagues at the NSC and the State Department, the reason people measure fisheries really well is not because they care about fisheries, but it's amazing the number of wars that have been started over fisheries. So like it's actually like an interesting sort of security concern, and lots of things in the ocean are actually national security concerns, which I learned recently, which is kind of interesting. Tourism, less so, and as you got down to transportation and offshore minerals, things get, you know, they're not disaggregated easily, and sometimes it's actually pretty hard to pull them out. That's production. That's like what we're taking out, turning into money, turning into jobs. If you look at what we're measuring in terms of assets on national balance sheets from these 14 countries, and remember, these are the 14 countries that stood up and said, we care about the sustainable ocean economy. This is a selected sample that you would think would be most likely to be doing the measurement. And we can sort of work through what's on their balance sheet. So the ocean fits in a section of the balance sheet called non-financial assets, not money assets. And non-produced assets, these are things people didn't build. So like a non-financial produced asset would be like the buildings at Yale, right? It's not a financial asset. They're not particularly liquid, but it's a physical thing people built. That sits here. Then you can get down to non-produced assets other than land. So most of the non-produced assets are land. And by the time you got to something that looked like it might be ocean assets, we were down to 2 of the 14 countries. And I can tell you, the US doesn't do it. France doesn't do it. The UK has started doing it, but I don't know if they did it when we actually did this study. One of the things we did do during this time to really sort of drive home what this kind of work can do is Norway, who was the chair of the high-level panel, did not have an ocean economy account. They had a bunch of data just scattered all over the place, but they hadn't pulled it together into an intelligible way to look at it. So I asked one of my former PhD students, Ethan Attica, I said, hey, go take a look at Stats Norway data or Fisheries Norway data and just see if you can make like a little toy dashboard that will like sort of show what you might want to do. What Ethan actually did is he scrubbed all of the data from Stats Norway, Fisheries Norway, Energy Norway, Ocean, like a bunch of different agencies, and built a ocean economy account. And he did it using a Microsoft Power BI dashboard. And he basically said, since nobody can really agree on the boundaries, there's like a whole bunch of interesting toggle things that you can say, like, I want to define the ocean economy this way or that way or the other thing, and switch through and look at different baselines. And so you can go play with it. It's still live. It hasn't been updated since 2016 when Stats Norway changed some of their data formatting. But what has happened is my colleague who worked with us on this, who was at Stats Norway one night, got a call from the foreign minister of Norway saying, I like this. Why did people at Yale do this? Why aren't we doing this ourselves? So last year at sort of the big national accounting meeting where folks do worry about these issues, the London group, Stats Norway was presenting their first ocean account. And my understanding is they are working on building it towards an official dashboard. So we do see, and I have actually been Ethan and I have been asked by like half a dozen countries to help do this sort of thing. So there's a lot of movement to organize the ocean science data into a way that's intelligible for economic decision makers. And I hope vice versa, right? I really do think there's things we can learn both ways. I will give you the quick tour de force of what's going on in the world, of where to look if you are interested, because I know I'm standing like between you and like getting to like have conversation and snacks and stuff. So Australia's been doing a bunch of really cool work related. Some of their most recent work relates to seagrasses, mangroves, and blue carbon. And so really thinking about the ocean climate interactions in their accounts. Portugal has been considered a longtime leader in the area of ocean accounting. Portugal has probably the most developed satellite ocean account, but it is a purely production account. It does not have the capital, the underlying like biological assets or biological resources. It's also really fascinating to read these, like the share of these that are like, it was like a 2% of this is like lawyers who work on marine law. Like there are things that are like just really interesting of how people are like, I came at this thinking very much as like, there's like biological oceanography type stuff and fisheries and maybe marine minerals and like natural resource base, but there's a lot of non like resource stuff going on in the ocean, which is fascinating. As I said, the UK, I'm going to flip through this, has probably one of the more developed ones. They break down their marine assets by some sectors, looking at marine recreation, carbon sequestration, fossil fuel production, wastewater management, capture fisheries, aesthetics, renewables, and minerals. They've broken this out, really looking at how the sustainability of different fisheries are factoring into their wealth stored in their marine assets. They look at recreation, the role of recreation in creating welfare for visits to coastal and non-coastal areas. And I think this one's really interesting here because they're actually looking at the trying to include the value of effluent management provided by ocean estuaries to the British economy. I guess technically to the English economy. They usually correct me when I get those things wrong. If we start breaking down the U.S. account, this is the marine economy satellite account that does not have assets in it yet. This is where sort of the gross output. So again, sort of the amount of revenue generated out of the ocean. You can sort of see what we're looking at in the U.S. Tourism is a bit, and this is 2019 and 2020, blue and orange, keeping you on your toes. Tourism, recreation is king, followed very quickly by national defense and public administration. A lot of minerals that includes offshore oil production, transportation, and then living resources is the little bit down here. But there's another big all stuff here. Another way to break this down, just to see this slightly differently, is it's about 1/3 national defense and public administration. And that could ultimately include things like geological carbon sequestration in the ocean, right? If it's the federal government paying for it, it's going to wind up in this bucket. I think if states are paying for it, it'll wind up in this bucket as well. Tourism and recreation is about a third, and then everything else is about a third in what we're producing. And so fisheries here is a small sliver, about 5%. Offshore minerals is about twice that. But I think that this is really interesting. A big motivation on the IUU work, if you go and look at the international agreement that just came out on IUU fishing a few months ago, a big part of that actually relates to human trafficking and labor enforcement laws. And that's actually how it sort of worked its way through. So it's really quite interesting, the connections between sort of the sustainable use of our oceans, their contributions to climate, and things like labor laws. If you go into the national strategy to actually start putting those assets on the books in the U.S., you can see that NOAA is starting out with commercial and possibly recreational fisheries. They've been a bit coy about that. Offshore energy assets. And while it's not in the plan, I was recently at a meeting with the folks at NOAA leading this, and they said something about beach recreation. I don't know if they're going to do that or not. It's going to be linked to the existing marine economy, the marine economy satellite account data. I should also mention there's another big data set that you might be interested in called eNow, Economics National Ocean Watch, which has a lot of economic data connected to the ocean for the U.S. as well. That's it's easily more disaggregated, but doesn't sum up as well as the marine economy satellite account. You can see the many different agencies involved with doing this. For the ocean account, it's primarily NOAA and the BEA, but with some inputs from BOEM and USGS and EPA, NASA, and others. And we're seeing movement on this already. The president's budget this year has $8.5 million for the BEA to start doing not just the ocean part of this work, but the whole plan. And NOAA has funding in its blue economy work stream for this work. Very quickly, I will show you a mock-up of how all of this comes together with some fish in the Baltic Sea. We started looking at this. We were looking at herring, sprat, and cod. Herring and sprat are prey fish. Cod is a predator. Cod is a high-valued fish. Herring and sprat are relatively low-valued in the commercial fishery. Looking just at commercial fisheries, this is just sort of a time series of what's happened to these stocks over time. People are worried about cod. There's complex management in here. We start off with a sort of trying to create as realistic and sort of model as we can of not just the ecological interactions among these three species. And what we leave out is all of the salinity dynamics and temperature dynamics that are going on in the Baltic Sea. We sort of abstract from those, but we spend a lot of time getting how the fishing industry works right, and how basically the Polish fishing fleet responds to changes in the fish stocks. We build this up, and we look at this under two management regimes, a management regime that's sort of what I'll call the traditional maximum sustained yield regime, where you look at species A, species B, species C, set quotas for all of them independently. And then while we were doing this, the management group that manages this fishery was experimenting with the idea of something called maximum multi-species maximum sustained yield, or an ecosystem-based approach to actually managing this fishery. And so we said, okay, well, let's sort of tune our model to do that. And what you find out is you get more cod with single species management than ecosystem-based management, but you get a lot more prey fish. But what winds up happening is the ecosystem-based management approach is much more profitable in the long run. And the reason for this is for a given kilogram of cod swimming out in the Baltic Sea, it is far more productive. And you get you get a lot more production out of the slightly lower valued prey fish species, which are also harvested. And so we're able to actually come up with prices that could be used in national accounts. I'm going to spin through this for a moment for this group. But what we wind up seeing is that the shift to ecosystem-based management probably increased the wealth stored in the Baltic Sea by about a third. And it's and this is not surprising if you think about the fact that if you're managing a system ignoring the interactions, you are going to do worse than if you try and manage a system accounting for important interactions. And this is how the science sort of flows through. And so what you would see happen here in sort of a national balance sheet approach is you would see a big bump up in wealth through these managerial changes, right? And so what we'd be able to have then is think about the national narratives, or the narratives we start telling ourselves about the management of whether it's the ocean or the climate, when we start thinking about the wealth that's both stored and saved, just like our savings accounts are going up or down, depending on the decisions that we are making. And that's a big part of why this is so important to think about the sustainability of the ocean economy. So just to wrap up, I think measuring the ocean economy, marine economy, blue economy, like there are far too many papers already deciding which word should be used. It's like this big thing of water out there, right? And it's how the economy attaches to it. It is absolutely critical for the policy narrative. The early ocean accounts were primarily cheerleading exercises for industries dependent on the oceans. But if we actually think about the ocean as an important asset to society and for climate management, for food security, for recreation and leisure, then we really don't want that driven by the people cheerleading the ocean because their industry depends on it, right? Like maybe there's a partnership there, maybe not, but we kind of want objective measurement. What this is really doing at the end of the day is organizing scientific data that we are creating and connecting the marine science with the economics and policy concerns. This is the kind of data that the CEOs of banks are willing to look at. This is the kind of data that folks at the Federal Reserve are willing to look at. This is the kind of data that Janet Yellen, when she was here a few weeks ago, thought already existed and was very happy that the US was actually getting it together and hadn't realized we were so far behind. So I think we spend a lot of time thinking about how to communicate our science. And I think this is a very powerful vehicle for communicating science to audiences that I would say are science curious, but like are only going to give you 30 seconds. Measuring the ocean economy, it's happening around the world, and it can happen. It's going to happen with or without scientific engagement. And so I think I will let you all decide which of those two pathways you would like to happen, but it's going to move, and I think it's going to move relatively quickly at this point. Countries haven't really settled on how to make all of these measurements comparable, or even how to make all these measurements reliable and repeatable yet. So there's a lot of opportunity there. And so much has changed so quickly. And I would be remiss because I can hear Jane Lubchenko, who I spent 19 months working for, pointing out that by doing this, what we can really do is we can often think about the ocean as a victim of climate change. We see areas warming, we see fish stocks getting pushed around, potential security concerns because of that, right? But we can also think about how the ocean can be part of a sustainable economic development that combats climate change, and how the ocean, plays an important role in the carbon cycle. So with that, I will stop. I think that's my last slide.